The portrayal of Lieutenant Robert Brewer in Band of Brothers leaves many viewers with the impression that he was reckless, inexperienced, and largely dismissed by the men around him. In the episode Replacements, he appears only briefly, yet the scene paints a deeply unflattering picture. Easy Company is shown advancing toward the Dutch town of Nieuwenan when Brewer casually walks far ahead of the column down an exposed road, almost swaggering as tanks rumble behind him. Several soldiers mock him, joking that he looks like General George S. Patton, moments before a German sniper shoots him in the neck. Makes him appear foolish and arrogant, as though his own carelessness caused his downfall. The reality, however, was far different. Robert Brewer was not some inexperienced officer who had suddenly appeared in Holland. By the time of Operation Market Garden, he had already been through some of the most brutal fighting of the war. Commissioned in 1942, Brewer served as assistant leader of the battalion's 81mm mortar platoon and parachuted into Normandy on D-Day with the rest of the regiment. He fought at Brecourt Manor and had already proven himself under fire long before the events in the Netherlands unfolded. After the Normandy campaign ended and the division returned to England, Brewer was reassigned to Easy Company's 1st Platoon under Lieutenant Thomas Peacock. He was a seasoned airborne officer who had survived combat that many others had not. The medic who rushed to Brewer's aid that day, Albert Montpre, later spoke openly about how inaccurate the television version of events was. In the series, the men of Easy Company are shown lounging on British tanks near a road while Brewer stands out in the open. Montpre explained that nothing about that scene resembled reality. There were no tanks nearby, no dramatic road leading into town, and the shooting did not even happen near Nieuwenan. The incident actually took place outside Eindhoven before the city had been fully liberated by the 101st Airborne Division. The fighting around Nieuwenan occurred later and was heavily exaggerated for television. Even veterans like Donald Malarkey later confirmed that the scene had been dramatized. The series also showed Bull Randleman among the men responding to Brewer after he fell, but according to accounts from those who were actually there, it was Walter Gordon and a few unnamed paratroopers who initially reached him. They checked his wounds, believed he was beyond saving, and moved on as the battle continued around them. The misunderstanding surrounding Brewer's actions often ignores a crucial reality of airborne warfare. Officers in airborne units led from the front. Men like Richard Winters and Ronald Spears repeatedly exposed themselves to enemy fire while guiding their troops through dangerous situations. Brewer was doing exactly what airborne officers were expected to do. According to accounts written after the war, he was leading the advance across open terrain carrying binoculars and a map case. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he naturally drew attention and became an easy target for the sniper hidden ahead. Winters reportedly tried to call him back, but the warning came too late. Years after the war, Albert Montpre gave a vivid description of what really happened that day. The battalion had been moving through a lightly wooded area that opened onto a broad field. Beyond the field stood 4 houses. As Montpre watched Easy Company riflemen advance ahead of him, someone suddenly shouted for a medic. Confused, he asked why they needed him when Easy Company already had several medics attached to it. Nevertheless, he rushed forward toward the tree line, where paratroopers huddled in a trench pointed toward a wounded officer lying exposed in the field. It was Lieutenant Brewer. Ignoring the cries that he was crazy to run into the open, Montpre sprinted toward Brewer anyway. When he reached him, he found the lieutenant badly wounded from a sniper's bullet through the neck. Unlike the dramatic television depiction, there was little blood. Brewer was barely responsive. Montpre calmly reassured him that he would take care of him, then began applying sulfur powder and bandages before struggling to insert a plasma needle into Brewer's arm. As he held the IV bottle above him, another medic dashed out to assist. The sniper then shifted his attention toward the medics. Bullets snapped through the air and slammed into the dirt around them. At one point, Montpre heard a sharp crack and feared the IV bottle had shattered, only to realize it was still intact. The second medic lost his nerve and ran back toward cover, while Montpre remained beside Brewer alone in the field. More paratroopers, attempting to help, were struck down around them. Then Montpre himself was hit. A bullet tore into his left leg with such force that he later said it felt as though he had been smashed with a baseball bat. Looking down, he could see bone exposed through the wound. Even then, he refused to abandon Brewer. He injected himself with morphine, lay back down beside the wounded lieutenant, and asked grimly whether Brewer was dead because if he was, Montpre admitted, he intended to leave. Brewer weakly whispered back, "No, but I don't know why not." The two men remained pinned in the field as bullets churned the dirt around them. 5 Americans now lay dead or wounded nearby. In the middle of the chaos, a group of Dutch civilians suddenly emerged carrying a ladder. Showing extraordinary bravery, they reached the wounded men under sniper fire and used the ladder as an improvised stretcher to drag Brewer to safety. One civilian even grabbed Brewer's M1 carbine and emptied the rifle toward the sniper's position in fury. As the civilians evacuated the wounded, Montpre became alarmed when they began moving toward the same houses from which the sniper fire had come. Near one of the buildings, a Dutch woman shouted the word "tot," meaning dead. Montpre could not tell whether she was referring to the sniper or someone else entirely. Soon after, Easy Company Sergeant Mike Ranney called out that they had gotten the sniper. The German hiding in the 4th house had finally been killed. Inside one of the homes, Montpre was struck by the immaculate condition of the floors, such a strange contrast to the horror outside. The morphine began making him nauseous, and through hand gestures he managed to communicate to a Dutch woman that he was about to vomit. She quickly understood and brought him a bowl. Once the wounded Americans were treated, the civilians loaded them onto a cart and attempted to move them toward safety. Despite renewed German fire, Montpre's ordeal was still far from over. While being transported, he dove headfirst into a German foxhole during another burst of shooting before Dutch civilians dragged him back out and continued carrying him onward. Eventually, he reached a local hospital and was later evacuated to a military hospital in Belgium. There, doctors discovered an additional bullet wound in his groin that had gone unnoticed because of the chaos and pain from his shattered leg. After surgery and recovery in England, Montpre expected to rejoin his regiment immediately, but instead he was briefly assigned to a replacement depot, dreaded by many GIs. Eventually, he returned to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment in France in late 1944. Only weeks later, he found himself fighting once again during the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the war and lived a remarkably long life, passing away in 2019 at the age of 97 as the oldest surviving medic from the battalion. Robert Brewer also survived what should have been a fatal wound. After recovering, he rejoined Easy Company near the end of the war and later went on to serve with the OSS during the Korean War. In 1957, he began working with the Central Intelligence Agency, spending much of his career involved in anti-narcotics operations in Thailand. After decades of service, he eventually became a teacher in civilian life. He died in 1996 at the age of 72. In the end, Brewer's real story is far more compelling than the simplified version shown on television. Rather than being a foolish officer wandering carelessly into danger, he was an experienced combat veteran leading from the front in the tradition expected of airborne officers. The reality of that day near Eindhoven was not one of incompetence, but of courage, confusion, sacrifice, and survival.